Alvin Toffler, it's been 10 years since Future Shock. There was a paperback in that intervening period, and more or less autobiographical text. But you're not a fast writer, are you?
No, I spend a lot of time researching what I write and thinking about it. And it took a long time for this book to gel, because 10 years ago when I wrote Future Shock, it was apparent to me that we were in for a tremendous bombardment of change. But it wasn't clear then, at least to me, how the many changes that we were facing in our jobs, in our families, in our technology, in our communications, in our political lives, it wasn't clear how all of those fit together. In the past decade, it seems to me certain patterns have emerged, and it is now possible to look at all of these changes in all of these aspects and spheres of our lives and see connections, see how they fit together. And I believe that they do, and that if you stand back far enough and look at the big picture, in quotes, you will see an amazing historical that we live in an amazing historical moment, a time when a completely new civilization is washing in, so to speak, or rolling in like a wave, and challenging all the old institutions, whether it's the nuclear family, or the bureaucratic corporation, or the nation state, or certain kinds of work, routine, repetitive work, and so forth. And I think that it's a fantastically exciting moment to be alive.
If we can just stick with Future Shock for a minute, it was sort of a treatise. I think it began with a Fortune magazine article, or that's first.
Horizon magazine.
Horizon magazine. Mm-hmm. Okay, one of the big glossy format magazines. And what we were saying, what we ran into for the first time, is that the future is not just a thing out there, that it affects you, that you can get caught up in it, that change can have an impact on, how you digest your food as well as how you pay your taxes. Anything in the past decade to change your mind about anything you wrote in Future Shock?
Sure. If I were rewriting Future Shock now, there are parts of the argument of that book, or parts of the book, that I would undoubtedly write differently. The main thrust, the main argument of the book, which is that it is possible to overload people with change, that it's possible to overwhelm their ability to adapt. I believe that's correct, and I think the last 10 years, if anything, has supported that argument very well. I think we're seeing a lot of future shocked people and future shocked institutions in our society that are simply overwhelmed and incapable of coping with the changes facing them. So the basic argument of the book, it seems to me, was correct. Now, the main drawback, or the main shortcoming of the book, as I look back on it now, was that I allowed myself too easily to accept the conventional wisdom of the economists of that era. Remember that parts of that book were written in the late 60s, and it was published in 1970. That was a time when economists were still saying, oh, we really understand the economy. What we need is growth, and we understand the economy so well we can fine-tune it, and that we're on an upward track toward endless affluence. Now, I accepted that as the dominant wisdom of the time too readily. And in a way, I underestimated the acceleration of change. Even I, who was arguing that change was moving rapidly, and many people, in any case, challenged that view, underestimated both the speed of change and the profundity or power of the change, because what happened was, while in that book I mentioned or referred to what I call the general crisis of industrialism, of industrial societies, and that was early on, long before the energy crisis and so on, that crisis had not yet struck the economic system. And it happened sooner than I anticipated. So that if I were redoing the book now, I would probably redo the economic assumptions on which Future Shock was based. But the basic argument about how people react to change and how change affects organizations and institutions and the difficulties we have adapting was correct. Also, there were other things in the book that I think history has borne out. At the time When I wrote, at the time I wrote Future Shock, I spoke about cloning, and I spoke about genetic engineering, and people said that was fantasy, it was blue sky, it was futurist nonsense. But 3 years later, we learned to splice genes, and since then we've had the, quote, test tube baby, and so forth and so on. So that I think the book was well in advance and correct on that. I think when we wrote Future Shock, my wife and I worked very hard on the question of family life. And when we first began our research, we were assured by all the sociologists we talked to and all the census statisticians and all the so-called experts that the nuclear family was a stable and permanent part of life. I challenged that view. I wrote a chapter called The Fractured Family, and I think the past 10 years have borne out the argument. So that Future Shock, on the whole, I think, has stood up reasonably well. There are parts of it that should be rewritten.
You, in effect, have rewritten the economic section in Ecospasm. That was a supplement, in effect.
Well, yes. In 1974, after the OPEC embargo, when the world economy was obviously going into some sort of paroxysm, I decided that I really would like to know more about that. I'd like to learn more about it. So my wife and I set off around the world, and we talked to economists from Singapore to London, and however, one doesn't learn about economics just by talking to economists. In fact, there are those who would argue that's the worst way to learn about it. We talked to business people and working people and trade union officials and so on, and read a lot, and came back and wrote Ecospasm, which tried to point out, everybody was talking about the economic crisis. I tried to point out in that book that what appeared to be an economic crisis was really part of a much larger crisis, the crisis of industrial society as a whole, that it wasn't just the economy that was in trouble, but also the energy system, the ecological system, as well as all the social and political systems. But the book focused mainly on the economic crisis.
Those, in effect, are both special cases of what you see now as the third wave. Let's talk about the first two waves just briefly, and then spend some time on your thesis here. First wave.
Well, first let me say that one can look at human history and one can slice it up into as many pieces as one wants. We can divide history into 3 pieces or 300 pieces or 3,000 pieces. It seemed to me that we are suffering from a bombardment of headlines and blips of information and bits and pieces, and it was necessary for somebody to stand back and take a really long view of where we stand at the moment. And that's what I tried to do in the third wave. And so I divided history, again, not very originally, others have done this before, into 3 parts. I said that the first wave of change was triggered by the agricultural revolution. And prior to the agricultural revolution, which began 10,000 years ago, most people lived hunting, fishing, herding. Many were nomadic. We didn't have permanent settlements. We didn't have cities. We didn't have writing. We didn't have all the things that we now regard as part of civilized existence. The first wave of change began sometime back there, as far as we can judge, maybe 8,000 BC or 10,000 years ago all told, and rolled slowly across the planet. More and more people became farmers. Fewer and fewer remained as nomads. Then, 300 years ago, the Industrial Revolution exploded and launched a second great wave of change across the planet. And the industrialization process that followed, which I call, that is what I term the second wave of change, moved across the planet at a much more rapid rate. And in a mere 300 years, we've managed to industrialize about a quarter of the Earth, so that 1 billion of the world's 4 billion people now live in industrial societies. And up until about the mid-1950s, most of the forecasts for the future, most of the views of where we were going, including those of men like Orwell and Huxley and many futurists and science fiction writers and forecasters and planners, assumed that where we were going was simply to extend the Industrial Revolution, that we were going to make technology bigger, that we were going to make bigger cities, that we were going to have bigger bureaucracies, that government was going to get bigger, that people were going to become more uniform and robotized, that conformity was going to be more and more the case. In short, they took all the characteristics of industrial society, which became a mass society based on mass production, mass communication, mass entertainment, mass education, and extended them forward in a straight-line fashion. Now, good futurists know how dangerous it is to draw straight lines into the future, to extend things and extrapolate them in a straight-line fashion. And I think sometime around 1955, 1960, 65, depending upon what country we're looking at, history made a U-turn. And that instead of moving forward, instead of the second wave continuing to gain force, a third wave of change began, and that we're now beginning to feel the impact of this truly explosive set of changes, which are in many ways dramatically revolutionizing daily life.
A U-turn is probably not a good way.
A U-turn may not be the correct way, because we're not going back.
That was the Consciousness 3 thing.
That's right.
Where people were talking about a return to the, in effect, a return to the first wave.
Right.
That's not what you're...
No, that is not what I'm saying. I think that I'm glad you caught that. I don't believe we're going back to a pre-industrial or pre-technological society. I think we're leaping into a new stage of society, a new stage of existence, which will be more advanced technologically than we ever have been before, but that will have a different kind of social and cultural and political frame, that people will live differently as a result, that the new technologies do not require us to live in a mass society any longer. In fact, they encourage diversity. They make possible and encourage individualization. They do many of the things that we complained the second wave technologies of the past did not do. And we now have an opportunity, I think, to create a really humane society which makes responsible use of what we've learned from science and technology.
This interview with Alvin Toffler continues on Side B. Vital History Cassettes for June 1980, number 1, Side B. An interview with Alvin Toffler continued.
Well, let's talk a little bit about science and technology in that context, and then we'll get into the social aspects of things. Science and technology, in the view of people around, concerns itself with quarks, which I'm sure are just marvelous little things, but they're totally irrelevant to your day-to-day concerns. Perhaps even the people that carry a pocket calculator, which, you know, last time we talked was a much more expensive and a much bigger and heavier thing. It hasn't made as much impact as people might think. And now you're saying that all of a sudden science and technology are going to alter the way life is done, alter our inner lives.
But let me say this. I think there is one of the arguments I make in this book, The Third Wave, is that that it is not technology and science that change history by themselves. There is no single driving force in history. Some people think that technology determines the way we live. Well, I would argue that science and technology, while very powerful, are only one of many forces that are converging now to change our lives. Look at population levels. They're also changing the way we live. Look at what we're doing to family structure. That's also changing the way we live. Look at how the culture is changing and the values of the society are changing. They're changing technology as well, and how we handle technology in the society. So that it's a mistake to single out any one particular factor as the quote cause of all of this disruption, upheaval, and reconstitution of society.
Would you accept, however, that communications is the facilitator that allowed the first wave to take 10,000 years and the second wave to take 300?
Surely, advanced communications is a powerful accelerator. It helps accelerate. But so did cheap energy. In other words, if I look at the last 300 years of industrial development in the West and in the Soviet Union, and all of these countries that we now call industrial nations, had they not had cheap supplies of energy from the non-industrial parts of the world, their development would have been much slower. It seems to me cheap fossil fuels and cheap oil hastened the overall economic and technological development of these societies. So there are multiple accelerators at work. One was the hidden subsidy of cheap resources and cheap energy. Communication clearly has a powerful impact because it also alters the way we think, and in turn that speeds things up, or can speed things up again. And I think that's happening now.
Okay. The third wave breaking over us now. Let's take human beings from the time they're born and see what kind of man that child is the father of.
Mm-hmm.
Today's child, growing up in a technological society, most likely, I think in the last count, named Michelle or Stacy or something like that. Hardly any Marys or Janes left anymore, Susans. They've all gone by the board. Tell us what these people are.
Well, I think the way to understand the changes is to see the contrast between the way things were during what I call second wave civilization and the way things might be as we move into third wave civilization. Starting at the beginning, the first stage of life for a child growing up during second wave civilization, during the entire industrial era, was life in a nuclear family. By and large, whereas before the Industrial Revolution, families tended to be very large, work together as an economic production team in the fields or in the cottages, with the kids pitching in and working, that system of that kind of family life gradually changed as the second wave swept over the earth, and families became smaller. And we moved toward what we now call the nuclear family, generally speaking, the husband working, the wife staying home, and with a small number of kids, 1 or 2 kids. And a child grew up in that nuclear family. And the child never saw work, never saw paid work. The mother worked, but that was not regarded as work. The father worked someplace, but he worked in a factory or an office, out of sight of the child. And so a tremendous divorce occurred, or cleavage sprang up between the different aspects of one's life and that child's perception of life. Work was something segregated over there. It's not something you did all the time or intermixed with your leisure and was part of your family.
Yeah, you went to work.
You went to work. So the kid grew up in that kind of family. The kid received messages from whereas in the past, in a pre-industrial society, during first wave society, the messages the child received were from the family, the church, and the local lord, and those messages were very simple and primitive, and there was no education. The child now, in a second wave society, moved into a mass education school, which was set up like a factory, and which in fact was intended unconsciously to prepare that child to go to work in a factory or an office, operating very much like a factory. So there are bells that ring. The kid is taught to march when the bell rings so that he arrives at the factory gate later on as a worker. Kid does repetitive work so that he will be a good and resigned worker, resigned to doing repetitive work in the factory later on. The schools machined the children into an industrial workforce in second wave society. And then finally the child went to work in a huge bureaucracy, whether in a corporation or a socialist production enterprise, as they call them in their part of the world, and spent his or her life permanently in some permanent niche in a corporate structure. Now look at what's happening. What's happening today, first of all, is that very few of our children now are brought up in nuclear families. 1 out of 7 children in America today is already brought up in a single-parent household rather than a 2-parent household. And in the urban areas, it's 1 out of 4, which is a staggering statistic and a reflection of the breakdown of that old nuclear family system. The kid grows up in a world in which there are many different kinds of family arrangements available. As you get older and you may have to make a choice about what family life you want, the child may decide, the child, now an adult, can decide to live unmarried in a couple, can decide on a childless, work-oriented couple, can decide to join a commune someplace. There is a variety of family structures available. One of the most important family structures that I believe we're going to see, and I believe many people are going to opt for in the years ahead, will be what I call the electronic cottage, in which many people, instead of going to work in a factory, will indeed stay home and work in do their jobs in their own living rooms and kitchens. And the reason for that startling turnabout or change is very deep. It's not simply because people resent commuting, and I think people will particularly resent it as the cost of gasoline goes up from $1 to $2 to $2.50 to $3 a gallon. I think that what we're going to see is that the high cost of commuting, on the one hand, will be contrasted with the declining cost, the plummeting cost of computers and calculators and television screens and telephone communications and so on, so that it's going to become very cheap for companies to put simple, easy-to-operate, non-technical tools in the kitchen or in the dining room, and for people to do their jobs at home. For example, I know of 3 writers right now on Business Week who, at their own expense, are buying electronic typewriters, smart typewriters, and hooking those into the telephone line so that they can work at home and send their stories to the magazine without having to go to the editorial offices. I know a woman who is now planning to set up a company which will put word processing machines, again, these smart electronic typewriters, into shopping centers next door to nurseries, so that suburban housewives can come in, put their kids in the nursery, work 2 or 3 hours at their own convenience, whatever times they choose, on those electronic word processing machines. That's only a step away from putting the machines in the home. So gradually, even today, we have millions of people who work at home. They may be insurance salesmen or engineers or consultants or clinical psychologists or what have you. But when we begin to put tools into the home, I think we're going to see a substantial shift of population into the home. And the child growing up in the new society will have as one of the options to choose a form of work and a form of family life that fits with that work-at-home pattern.
Daniel Bell, who's a professor at Harvard, sees a future filled with little Harvard professors.
Indeed.
And Herman Kahn, who is a large man who enjoys life immensely, sees a sybaritic society in the future. You, sir, who are a writer and work at home, see in the future
and work with my wife and think people will work together in their homes.
And probably have an electronic typewriter around there someplace.
Right.
See that everybody's going to have electronic processors. What is the danger there that you are projecting from your own experience?
Surely. It's impossible, I think, to write and not project somewhat from one's own experience. In fact, one of the myths that seems to me to invalidate or weaken much of social science is its attempt to be like physics. Social scientists are taught to ignore their own personal reality. They're taught to ignore what their eyes and ears tell them and to study the statistics. I think that is a foolish way to understand what's going on in our world. You need to understand the statistics, but you also have to correlate them with personal experience. Now, it is impossible not to project your own experience as a writer, and I recognize that and am amused by it. People often ask me, well, are we a third-wave couple, or do we live a third-wave lifestyle? And I think the world is not neatly divided between second-wave people and third-wave people, but that all of us have elements of both, or many of us have elements of both in their way of life already. So that I'm not suggesting that everybody's going to work at home. I'm not suggesting that everybody would want to work at home. Many people would hate it. Some people would be divorced the week after that system were introduced. On the other hand, I think many people are going to find that the stupidity, the irrationality of getting in a car and traveling for an hour and burning up mountains of, or burning up oil wells and filling the air with puke, in order to get to an office where they then pick up a telephone and spend the day on the telephone, is it's a form of insanity that will become increasingly apparent as the economics of the system change. Moreover, I have another suspicion. And for this, I have no statistics, but it would be interesting, and I would suggest to the Census Bureau that they look into it. I have a hunch that families in America today who run mom-and-pop businesses probably get divorced less often than those who don't. I have a feeling that families who run a little motel, or who run a gas station together, or who have a little store someplace in which the kids pitch in and the wife and the husband work together, I have a feeling that those families stay glued together better than the families in which work is separated from family life. Again, I could be wrong, but my instinct tells me that's probably correct. And I therefore feel that as more work shifts into the home, we will see some families split, but we will see other families glued together. And I think that in general it has many advantages for the society as well as for the individual. It can radically reduce our energy problem. It can radically reduce the problems of the cities by helping to disperse population somewhat. It can radically help us to create community and a sense of solidarity and belongingness in our suburbs where most Americans today live and which are graveyards during the day. It seems to me that people who do work at home no longer have to change. They no longer have to move every 2 years. The company doesn't have to transfer them. They can then sink some roots in the community they live in. They can participate politically. They can belong to the church. They can do all sorts of things that now they may not do because of the anticipation that they may have to move. So that I see electronics as bringing with it many positive or constructive changes to American life. There are always drawbacks. There are always dangers. There are always difficulties. But I think that we have so oversold the dangers that we haven't stopped to look at the advantages.
Okay, but we don't want to give the idea that the communications era, the electronic cottage, is even the sole component of
by
the
no
third
means. By no
third
means.
wave. The thing is that if there is any characteristic that represents the third wave, it would have to be the sheer diversity of this future you give us.
Exactly.
Where people are working at home.
Some people are working at home. Some people are working in offices. Some
people are working at Lordstown.
Some people are still working in Lordstown and still doing routine, repetitive work in old-fashioned, what I would call second-wave factories. I had a touching experience the other day. I talked with a factory worker who said he had read what I've written, or some of what I've written, and was greatly moved by the discussion of the new lifestyles that are possible. And then said, but how do I convey that to my boss? He said, I work in a factory. I'm a third-wave person caught in a second-wave job. And the answer, I think, is that when one civilization begins to move in, when a wave of civilizational change begins to move in, things don't change automatically. They don't change overnight. And what you can have, for me, the beauty of the argument of the third wave, or the use of the metaphor of waves, the reason I talk about waves of change, is that it isn't a black and white picture. By describing the changes striking us today in terms of waves, it's possible for us to see that America is feeling the impact of multiple waves of change simultaneously. There is still, the second wave is not finished. We are still industrializing. We're still completing the industrialization of America. And the example I give is one familiar to me from the book industry, where we, in the last 10 years, have seen the rise of bookstore chains like Walden's and Dalton's. And these didn't used to exist very widely in the States. This represents the completion of the process of mass merchandising and mass distribution that went with the Industrial Revolution. It just came late to the publishing industry. Other industries got there first. So we can see that there still is There still are routine factories where work is boring, monotonous, and awful. There still are industries that are just still catching up with the Industrial Revolution. But at the same time, there is a big piece of America that's already moving beyond that. And you can see the conflict between these in the meeting, for example, of a few weeks ago. A meeting took place of mayors. And at that meeting, the mayor of Youngstown, Ohio, met the mayor of Sunnyvale, California. And the mayor of Sunnyvale complained that his city is in the heart of Silicon Valley, where they make computer components and electronic chips and semiconductors and stuff. And he said, we've got so many jobs going begging here, we can't fill the available jobs because we don't have enough housing and enough facilities in the city to support the population that the jobs require. And the Youngstown mayor thought, as the article described it, that the Sunnyvale mayor came from another planet. Because in Youngstown, we're closing down steel mills, and we're laying off steel workers. And what we have is third-wave industries gaining and growing rapidly, particularly in places like California. Second-wave industries collapsing, crumbling in the Northeast and in other parts of the country. So we have both of these things taking place simultaneously, and they create, they both have different economic interests, different political interests, and collisions of interest between them.
Let's try for some short pictures of people in the third wave. Maybe we're talking about 10, 15, 20 years from now, turn of the century people. What I'm going to ask you to do is to tell me about a kid in the third wave. Build me a scenario
Okay,
of a
well,
kid.
we started to do that.
Then a scenario of a woman and a scenario of a man.
Well, I'm not sure I can cut it up that way because they interrelate. Okay. But let's take the kid. I described the kid before who grew up in a nuclear family, never saw work, went to a mass education school. Now that kid, 20 or 30 years from today, may very well have a different experience. It may very well grow up in a family in which husband and wife work at home. And indeed, some of the work may be simple enough or routine enough for the kid to actually participate in it. And so Johnny or Stacy or Michelle of tomorrow may be asked to put in some time helping mother and father with the work that they're doing. At least the simpler aspects of that work. Maybe it's sitting at a screen for a while and monitoring. Maybe it's just watching the television screen, but instead of watching some television program, they may be watching some process which is taking place 1,000 miles away in a factory. And the kid knows that if something happens on the screen or something flashes on the screen, call mommy quick, because that means some signal has to be fed in, or she has to type something, or she has to speak into that machine in a certain way. So that's one possible form of work that the kid might well participate in.
Child labor.
Child labor rears its pleasant head again, because indeed what the rules against child labor have accomplished is that we've created a labor market or a labor system in which young people have been kept out of work for so long that we've prolonged adolescence. So we have 35-year-old adolescents walking around who've never grown up and never had to do a day's work. And the consequence of this, I think, has been terrible for young people. I think that there has been a tremendous, that much of the alienation and anger and frustration of young people arises from the fact that they're in no way plugged into the real productive work of the society. So I see that as potentially positive, although, of course, there need to be protections and there can be abuses of it. In any case, the kid will grow up in a household seeing the work taking place.
And grow up faster in the process.
And I think, in the process, mature more rapidly. Now, there will be other kids who are not having that experience. The society is diverse. I believe we'll see an enormous return of education to the family, that the family will have a lot to do with the education of the youngster, and that family will have help from teachers and educators. They may have help from the television screen and indeed even from the computer. But let me say, I don't think that technology and the computers solve everything. I don't think that all of our problems are going to be solved through the introduction of a technological fix. I think they're part of what's happening to us, not everything. In any case, I think we'll see education, part of education, shifted back into the home. The school may be the place where the kid goes for social reasons, for sports, for meeting other kids, for the Saturday night dance.
The thing we've done to churches will happen to universities.
That's right. Then I think the family experience is likely to be quite different. The educational experience likely to be quite different, and then the work experience as the child grows up and enters into work, we're going to see a radical change in the character of the work that's done. Even if you don't work at home, even if you continue to work in offices and factories, I think they're going to be very different places from the ones we know today. My wife and I, in researching the third wave, have visited some of the most advanced factories in the world, and they give us a clue to the way things may be. One of the factories I describe, in contrast to the factories that I worked in when I was young, I worked in steel foundries and auto plants. I was a welder and a millwright and a punch press operator, and I did many of those second wave factory jobs, and not just for some time. I did them for 5 or 6 years of my life. And the contrast between the advanced factories of today and the factories that I used to work in, and that many Americans still work in, is enormous. At the Hewlett-Packard factory outside Colorado Springs, as I describe in the book, first of all, the place is quiet. What a relief not to hear the clanging, hissing roar of the machines. Basically, you can conduct a normal conversation. Second, the place is spotlessly clean. Not clean because somebody wants to provide marvelous working conditions, but because you can't get the job done if it's filthy and dirty. The new technologies require clean surroundings. Thirdly, people interact in a different way. The factories I worked in, there was a very clear class distinction between people wearing white shirts and people wearing blue denim. I was wearing blue denim at the time, and I remember how we hated those guys who came through with their white shirts and their underarm notepads, I forget what you call them, the board you carry with a notebook. These were the time study men and the expediters and the personnel people, and if you go to the new factories, you don't see a division between white shirts and blue shirts. Everybody's wearing a wild variety of sports shirts and slacks. People talk to each other in a different way. Instead of having the old hierarchy in which a message, if a worker discovers something's wrong on the job or needs a change made or there's a problem, it used to be that he had to go to the boss. The boss went to his boss, he went to the next boss, that boss communicated to another one, then it came down through 3 layers of bureaucracy and finally came down to somebody else to fix the problem. Today we don't use that kind of communication in the advanced factories. The worker or his foreman or her foreman can make the decisions by themselves. There's more discretion further down the line to handle those kinds of problems. Moreover, instead of everybody arriving at the same hour, there is flex time for millions of American workers, and will be more so in the future, so that people can tailor-make the schedule to suit their own lives. If you're a morning person, you may want to continue starting early, but if you're a night person, you may like to sleep later and work later in the day. That will be possible, as it already is for millions of Americans. More people will be working part-time on, part-time off. More people will be working at home, doing their own things, so to speak. I think we'll see a tremendous growth in what I call prosuming, as distinct from consuming. More people will be engaging in self-help movements, self-help organizations for psychological or health reasons. Others I think we'll see a tremendous growth in do-it-yourself activity, but not just of the classical simple forms of building your patio or fixing a window. I think we'll see very sophisticated and interesting forms of do-it-yourself spring up in the future as people become more educated, as systems as they, for example, may be able to get very complicated, interesting kits to build things and be able to telephone in to have a mentor or tutor at the other end of the line, advising them as to how to put the kit together and so on.